Even though labor has lost 2 million members over the last 20 years, the assets have risen from 11 billion in 2000 to around 29 billion now.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
So, Chris Bohner, is that the way you pronounce your last name?
Bohner. And that wasn't so great in middle school, but I survived, so I'm sticking with it.
There you go. There you go. So you have your own, a consulting firm now called Radish Research. Is that what it is?
Firm might be a little strong, but I worked for labor as a staffer for like 25 years, and it's me doing work for unions and other advocacy groups, and my staff is me. So yeah. Gotcha.
Now, so you just came out with a report that has gotten a definitely some amount of attention in Jacobin and in these times. Hamilton Nolan wrote about it, talking about the finances of unions. And so, the theme of the show today has just been kind of just straight union education. Yeah. And I think this is an important part of union activists understanding what's going on in our unions and what has been going on in our unions. And so if you could just go through what is the top line findings from your report about the finances of the labor movement in the United States?
I think the top line and sort of the surprise to me was that even though labor has lost 2 million members over the last 20 years, from a financial point of view, the assets have risen from something like 11 billion in 2000 to around 29 billion now. And so, I think there was a perception, and one I shared was that, this declining membership, at some point, unions are going to go bankrupt. And certainly some of them are in financial distress. And the union I worked for many years, Unite Here, was really adversely impacted by the pandemic. But so there has been this huge growth in assets, and I explored the reasons why and kind of link it to some theories about what labor should or shouldn't do. But the other top line sort of conclusion is that there's a lot of money available for organizing and other sort of supportive activities out there in this moment that I think for people in my generation who've been working in the labor movement for 2 or 3 decades, we've never seen anything like this, where the organizing conditions, the politics, the support for unions, the independent labor unions like at Amazon and Starbucks and new ones sprouting up every day, that is something that hasn't been seen for so long. And I think, there's a critique of labor in my report, but it's also, there's a huge opportunity. And I think that my sort of call was now's the time to do it. Now's the time to spend the money. Because there might not be another opportunity with some of the political changes that occur and changes in the economy.
Right. And just to put a number on that, you said, quote, in 2020, organized labor had $29.1 billion in net assets, and that figure has almost doubled since 2010, as we have lost hundreds of thousands, millions of union members across the same time, and our assets have almost doubled. How does that even happen?
Well, basically, it's kind of basic economics. Revenues are actually going up, and the spending is not going up as quickly as the revenues. And how are revenues going up if you're losing members? Well, for a lot of unions, the dues are set at like a percentage of your pay rate. So for workers in the unionized sectors, the pay has been going up for 2 decades. So union dues are going to continue to go up, and that's more than made up for the loss of membership. The other thing is that, as the dues keep going up, the other thing is that unions get a lot of investment income from their large assets. So they get, a lot from dividends and interest and rent, and that's been growing very rapidly as well. So basically revenues are rising faster than their spending. And in fact, the spending is below the inflation rate. That was before, the sort of crazy inflation we're seeing today.
Mm-hmm. And that $29.1 billion in net assets does not include the value of union pensions, which is trillions of dollars in assets. And so, the extent to which we could or should be strategically investing those is a conversation for another day. But this is just outside of the union pensions. And one of the, you mentioned that as revenue is increasing, the expenditures are not increasing as fast. And to put numbers to that, organized labor employs 23,000 fewer employees in 2020 compared to 2010. Our members have decreased, our assets have increased, but we have 20,000 fewer paid staff, which is pretty important. That's 20,000. I mean, how many people does one person that is working full time for a union, how many people could they be representing? How many people could they be organizing? That, if we say just 10 to 1, that's a huge amount of people that are being left either without representation or without somebody to help them organize a new union. That's a lot of people that we don't have anymore.
Yeah, and at the same time, the top level management officer occupations have grown, have gone up. So you're getting a more top heavy looking kind of organized labor is getting more management officer heavy, and it certainly was also, and I want to caution, it was a pretty gradual decline of staffers. The pandemic really, a lot of unions had to lay off staff. So that accelerated a process that was going on.
Right. And the numbers to that, management positions, you say, have increased by 28%, with more than 10,000 employees earning a gross salary over $125,000 a year. we can $125,000 is not it, that's something that a lot of union workers could potentially expect to make at some point during their career. It's not like they're not millionaires, right? But $125,000 is pretty good, and have 10,000 people making over that at the same time that we've cut 20,000 jobs. It just seems like just misplaced priorities. I don't understand how that gets justified. It's difficult for me to grok.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna, that's the census. That's what the census data shows, and I think there are, one of my explanations for what kind of happened to labor is, in 2009, when Obama was elected, we all thought labor law reform was happening. It was I think there were 58 Democratic senators at that time or something close. So it wasn't quite filibuster proof, but labor was really, we're going to start, the AFL-CIO was passing resolutions, get your money together, get ready to start organizing because we're passing this. And then, we didn't, just kind of like what happened with the PRO Act. And I think like what the kind of defeatism and letdown happened to a lot of the labor movement was like how, and a sort of determination that, you know what, you can't organize on scale with a broken labor law regime, which it is broken.
Mm-hmm.
But then, you know, we're seeing today is like, yeah, the labor law is horrible, and it's obviously hindering some of the most exciting developments, you know, like at Starbucks. But you can still organize, and plus with the Biden NLRB, the agency that enforces labor law, you know, is, you know, on a crusade in a way that in the union I came out of Unite here, we wouldn't even run elections because we felt it was just basically unfair, and the employer had too much power. So we would organize outside the board process. But so, I mean, I think there is a bit of I hope there is a kind of change in attitude that you can still organize even under this very unfair laws that favor employers over workers. So I do, you know.
Well, this is a bit of a side question, but I'm interested in you know, you mentioned that labor law reform did not happen under Obama, and labor law reform has not happened under Biden, and yet the terrain has changed drastically just by the NLRB beginning to enforce the laws that are on the books, and what I have tongue-in-cheekingly called law and order unionism, you know, at the NLRB. but yeah, I mean, why did we not get that under Obama? I mean, obviously this is a side question, but why did we not get that before?
I mean, it's the same, you know, I think Obama was never fully on board with, you know, he had an alliance with labor. We thought we had a stronger partnership. He certainly delivered some benefits, you know, but you know, it was the filibuster as well. And there was no push to really challenge the filibuster. There wasn't even really a debate as much as it is today, where you're looking at a split Senate, 50-50, you know, practically 50-50, that nothing's going to happen unless you confront the filibuster. So I think, and of course, there's so many Democratic politicians who pay lip service to labor, but when it comes down to the vote, they're not there. Right. And I mean, that's why I think some of the unions are pushing today that you force a vote on the latest iteration of labor law reform just to get people on the record. You know, even if you're not going to win that vote, I think that's a good idea. But so, I think Biden is just actually has more of a connection to the labor movement and is serious about it. You know, it's not perfect, but they're doing what they can with a split, with a very narrow majority in the Senate, right? Which I think and it's not just the NLRB. There's like, you know, all these labor provisions being attached to legislation. It's that are really going to help some sector unions grow. I think more on the construction side. You know, I don't think service workers have gotten their part yet. That was in the original Build Back Better bill. Would have, you know, I think was more in the service sector unions. But overall, like this even without fundamental labor law reform, the terrain is just so much better than it was over a decade ago.
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's, an important thing to look at is that even though we haven't had the significant labor law reform and, we've been waiting all this time for it, like you said, the terrain has changed and labor is growing. Our popularity with the public is growing. Our success rate in NLRB elections is growing. We're seeing new shops, new industries. So all those things point to there's clearly some momentum here And that's before labor has really invested in the way that it could. So I think that's something that I'm thinking about, when I look at your report. Okay, if we're doing all this right now on, like a shoestring budget comparatively, how much better could we be doing with some significant investment here? Because based on your reporting, there's room for investment. And I think, there's no better time than now. And so the idea of just being conservative with your assets, I could see where maybe that made sense in certain times and places for certain unions. But to me, it seems like if ever there was a time to go all in, maybe not 100% all in, obviously, you have to be good stewards of your members' dues dollars and, protect the long-term viability of your organization, obviously. But, if ever there was a time to go in and really increase investment into new organizing, to hiring new staff to organize, to funding solidarity funds and strike funds. I think we've got 90 Starbucks organizers have been terminated.
At least.
I think every union in the country should be jumping up to help make those folks whole while they wait on a decision. And we've seen some of that. We've seen some of the amazing support that our brothers and sisters down in Brookwood have had over the course of this, over 500-day strike at Warrior Met Coal.
The UFCW's
I think
donated.
There's room for more.
The UFCW's donated $400,000 to their strike fund.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and that's what I hope to see. And then I hope this report is generating these conversations about, just exactly what do we have in terms of resources and where could we spend more. And then, of course, that gets into the question of what's the most effective use of this new, influx of funding. And there's, we could all come up with our wish list, but I would say whatever they would spend it on, as long as it's related to adding and growing the labor movement, that's better than just sitting idle. And
Chris, you created a little bit of a wish list. So what was your, we make you king of the unions. What is it that you do?
Oh, I've already been accused of seeking that position. So I don't think it should be some top down.
We make you democratically king of the unions.
Right. A rank and file movement has appointed you our chief spokesman and delegate. What's the wish list?
This is it's if you go back to 1997 when you had the first AFL-CIO contested election, John Sweeney won that, and it was a big debate about what should be happening. And one of the things Sweeney really put forward was not only like an ambitious goal, I think was like $1 million or $2 million a year in new organizing, but he really wanted and pushed and publicly shamed unions that weren't spending 30% of their budgets on organizing. And there are, of course, unions that are doing that now, and up to 50%, but there's just not enough. And that's reflected in my data, which, doesn't look at individual unions. It looks at, the whole labor movement as a whole. But so, in the report, I call it like a thought experiment, because all this stuff has to go through the democratic procedures of the union. But just like, I read a lot about what people were advocating, and you could hire 20,000 new organizers. Apart from the practicality, that would cost $1 billion. Okay, you could, you could fund these sort of alternative labor organizations and the independent unions that are starting up at far significant higher rates if they want it. And I think at some point, as these independent unions mature and like some of the fights that are going to happen, there might be strikes. There will probably have to be strikes to settle things at Starbucks and Amazon, because the company is going to try to play it out for years if they can. So it's going to be incumbent on the entire labor movement to make sure these organizations are resourced to take the kind of actions that really inflict some pain on the companies, that bring them to the table. So, it's activities like that. I think, the strike activity has been low over the last decade, even though there's, really large strike funds. And striking is not just, a defensive, like you're trying to get your best contract, or you're trying to fight off management proposals that are trying to take back benefits you got. Strikes are also ways to organize. Ways to organize internally, but also your demands can include, organizing rights at subcontractors, or organizing rights at new places that open up. I mean, that was one of the strategies that I think many of the organizing unions use collective bargaining as a process, not only to address the contract, but also to tell the company that we're going to grow with you, and you're going to not fight us in the way labor law allows. If you open a new casino, or a new hotel, or a new facility, or a new auto part factory. So, and then I think at some point, I think some of the more militant voices are saying, we just need to violate, unjust labor laws, and things like secondary boycotts, and crazy court injunctions against, you can only have 2 people at a picket line or something like that. Violating that is like a huge liability for the union, but at some point, that might be necessary, and, it's scary, but, at some point, I think civil disobedience on a large scale against these unjust labor laws, it's a type of spending, mm-hmm. It's a type of spending. And I think this, when that moment arises, and I think it will, I hope the big unions step up, and they, yeah. So I'll leave it. Yeah.
Will the bosses see breaking the law and the fines that they get for that as a cost of doing business? I mean, I don't know if they've got like an expense report for, but effectively, whether they've got it in writing or not, we can tell by their actions that they obviously know in all of these campaigns that they're breaking the law. They know that. They have to know that. There's no way that they don't know that. And maybe they get fined, maybe they don't. Most of the time, they're not going to get fined in relation to labor law or by the NLRB, but OSHA violations, right? These are things that is just the cost of doing business. And because the law is so lopsided, the fines are going to be worse on the workers, but we should, there's no moral reason not to break an unjust law. It's just, what is it? Just looking at the cost. What is it going to cost us? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? And that's a question that I think that we should, like you said, we should be more receptive to being willing to have because the conversation is just not happening now by and large, except for a very, very, very few of the more militant voices. There's not a wide-scale debate going on in the labor movement about when should we start breaking the law? What laws should we start breaking? How much is that going to cost? Stuff like that. It's just not happening.
But it might be, one of the things about labor is it's very opaque. I don't think I could write this report if I was on staff of labor. It wouldn't be a good career move. But
as a former staffer, I can say absolutely you could not have. You could have written it. Getting it published, different story.
Yeah. So I suspect there are some very smart, committed people in the labor movement who I suspect are having internal conversations about this and thinking of ways, because I think there are a lot of committed voices that have been waiting for this moment. That I think there's discussions going on. They're just not going to have them in the public sphere. Yeah. But I don't know. I hope.
Right.
Well, and I would just add that there could be people listening right now who can facilitate these conversations and start asking these questions and having these conversations, among your own membership at your own local and go from there. But I really, just wanted to echo those sentiments, and I think the thought experiments are very useful in terms of being willing to break the law and the costs associated with that. The idea of investing in a significant amount of new organizers. And I do like that you also put it out there about kind of alternative labor formations. There are entire sectors of the American working class that are unorganized, or that in some cases fall outside of traditional labor law. We've got domestic workers and gig workers. And then I think we also,
workers.
yeah, absolutely. And we need to also be looking at, in terms of alternative formations, I'd love to see organized labor get more involved with the worker co-op movement. And even if it's just starting small with a handful of grants here and there, I think that's an opportunity, because if the big picture is, how do we shift the balance of power back to working people? Well, that is a technique, right? And we've even had people write into the show asking, like, hey, if I'm at a small place, like, what's better? Should I try to make it a co-op, or should I try to unionize it? And, it doesn't necessarily have to be an either or. I think these movements have to work in conjunction with each other. And, there are brilliant people out there already doing brilliant work around co-ops, and labor has resources that those folks could certainly benefit from. So that's one thing that I also hope comes from this report, is more dialogue between those two efforts.
Well, we could do a whole show on the worker ownership. I didn't put anything in that because I that's a whole different kind of report. I think that is the way to go. I mean, I think one plank, but like one of the largest worker co-ops is SEIU's home care workers, and I think it's in Boston or New York. And I know the steelworkers set up a partnership with the famous Spanish, the Basque, Mondragon.
Yeah.
So there's like interest in sectors of the labor movement.
The machinists have a lobster. The machinists have a lobster fishery up in Maine.
I did that. That's right. Yeah. I mean, that stuff is so exciting because it structurally addresses the inequality by really broadly distributing equity. And I would love to see, labor do that. I mean, there was a period in the 80s and 90s in the airlines and steel where there was a lot of worker buyouts, but they weren't, they were really distressed industries, and, the governance of them really didn't put forward, really advance like a sort of active militant involvement of the owners, the worker owners. But there's a lot to explore there. And I think it's super fertile area to go.
Yeah, I'm even thinking like right of first refusal as something that, labor can be advocating for, while at the same time, have some resources to put behind it, should they be successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think in the private sector we should be starting. People should have a campaign to never sign another contract without that in the thing. Right? That should be, and it's super. There's just no reason for the boss not to put that in. It's just super common sense to say that the people who do the work, if you're going to try to change something super drastically, you're going to try to go bankrupt or sell it to somebody, you should let the workers buy it first. Or you should give them the shot. But Chris, I wanted to, I want to be respectful of your time, and I appreciate you hanging around and being willing to talk to us. But I did want to make sure that I asked you what your thoughts are. You mentioned, you alluded to some of the critiques that you've gotten about it, and one of them is friend of the show. We've been Connor Lewis. We've had him on multiple times. And of course, I think that it was done in like a comradely and brotherly way, right? But he took issue with some of the way that your methodology in the report. He says Bohner applies general corporate financial principles when application of nonprofit financial principles would be more appropriate. And I'm not I don't really know what the difference is between corporate and nonprofit financial principles. I'm assuming that you do. So could you tell us what is his critique there, and what does that do to the viability of your report in your mind?
I'm working on my reply.
Okay.
Because he raised some good points, and certainly some I disagree with. But I think if I am characterizing his argument is, union assets are not just available for use. They're restricted. Some are in strike funds, some are in other funds. And if you look at a budget of a union or a nonprofit, you're going to see like the XYZ fund, the strike fund, the organizing fund, the training fund. And so essentially, he's saying, I think, is that treating all of these assets as available for use, for deploying for alternative kind of projects is you need to look at what's restricted and what's unrestricted. And, strike funds being the biggest category. I think strike funds are a really, interesting entry point into that, because a lot of assets are in strike funds. But where I think I disagree with Connor is these funds are also, there's a lot of democratic governance mechanisms that say we can use part of our strike fund for organizing if we need to. It's up to an elected executive board to shift assets in and out. They're far more fungible than I think he portrayed them. And I know, like, when I worked at Unite here, we had a strike fund, but then sometimes when our contracts weren't up for 4 years, we're like, we need assets for organizing. And it was the executive board voted on shifting, I'm making it up, $10 million to organizing. And then when we got closer, we, to the contract. So they move in and out. And I think that's a democratic process, and they're not just, written in stone. But the strike funds are probably the most significant restriction on the assets. So I think that's, what he was getting at there. And I certainly acknowledge strike funds are like probably the biggest restricted assets out there. But the other thing I think that I pointed out in my report is that, there are 29 billion in assets, but there's only been like on average $70 million a year in strike benefits, less than 1%. So if these assets are in strike funds, well, they're not being spent. So I'd say like they're not being spent, and nor is it raiding or an impermissible democratic maneuver to shift some of your assets to organizing out of a strike fund. Most of the unions have provisions for that.
Right. And I think that makes sense. And that is a reply to one of the things that he said, but I think I saw that critique in his report, and I basically kind of had the same thoughts that you did. I was like, I'm not too convinced of, the degree to which you think that this spending is set in stone. But he in one part of it, he's basically making the argument that, and it could be that I'm just not, it's gone over my head and you addressed it, but he's making the argument that basically you're overestimating the total amount available, like in all of this. And so, quote, Bohner applies general corporate financial principles. What does that mean? What corporate financial principles? When application of nonprofit financial principles would be more appropriate. Taking nonprofit accounting principles, the true excess is unrestricted funds available beyond a defense interval. So is then he saying that you shouldn't be counting restricted funds, quote unquote, at all in your analysis, or is there something else that I'm missing about the corporate versus the nonprofit financial principles?
Well, I think in that, it's just the nature of the information you get from the Department of Labor. And I'm just using, like, if you look at a nonprofit's financial statements filed with the IRS, I mean, they have income statement and a balance sheet, and that's basically what I did here. And that's what I think the minutiae of like accounting is probably lose some viewers, but I take the point that saying like not all the 29 billion of net assets are available, like just sitting in the bank, although a lot they are sitting in the bank. They're dedicated to different uses. And whether it be a strike fund or a training fund. And that's, if you get into a union's budget and you get access to the document, which a lot of times you can't, even if you're a member, you'll see we got X amount of assets in the strike fund, X amount of funds in the solidarity fund, X amount of, so, you know, I take the point that not all the assets are available to be used. I would argue that just because something's been put in an accounting category doesn't mean it's not subject to democratic control, worker control. Workers through their, you know, through the democratic governance can shift assets wherever. I mean, it's the workers' assets. They can like, just because they put it in some sort of accounting, you know, budget thing doesn't mean you can't change it.
Right.
I mean, that's what democracy is kind of about at the, you know, in the labor movement. It's like, you know, setting the budget, you know, through it. And there's debates, and there's often those debates lead, not often, but occasionally can lead to, you know, factions challenging the leadership, and that's healthy. I mean, I think that's part. So I think that addressed that point.
Okay.
But there was
Chris,
some other. I know he has a lot of. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I appreciate your time. I think the report is fascinating. I appreciate your tentative reply here to Connor, and I look forward to a more fleshed out response. I think I'll definitely be reading that. I'm sure Connor will as well. Adam, is there anything else that you wanted to ask him before we let him go?
I just wanted to say thank you, Chris, for pulling all this information together. I know it couldn't have been too easy to do that, to find it all and then to compile it as a report that has now, you know, spread around kind of the labor press. And I hope that it just facilitates more and more of these kind of conversations, to think about what assets we have, what resources are available, and how we could be, you know, maybe more strategic in using those resources. So yeah, thanks again, Chris, and thanks for being willing to spend some time on a Labor Day weekend Saturday.
Yeah, it's perfect.
We really enjoyed it.
It was great to be in a show, and I listened to the Labor 101, and that I think that kind of labor education is amazing. And to give my little final thing on that is that most unions, you know, you can find your financial report at the Department of Labor's website if you have some private sector unions. So I mean, hopefully this will also be a tool for activists within their union to understand a little bit better about where the money's going. And that's, I think, a Labor 101 tool as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Connor, Chris, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and yeah, hope you have a good weekend. Stay safe.
All right. Great to talk to you.
All right.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.